colleague Patricia Lorcin, who has kindly agreed to moderate the discussion, to introduce the topic and our speakers. I would like to thank all the organizations, centers, departments who have made this event today possible. I would like to start with the Jewish Community Relations Council of Minnesota and the Dakotas, JCRC, who has generously contributed with the co-sponsorship of this program. The German and European Studies Center, the Center for Jewish Studies, the Departments of French and Italian, Department of History, the Humphrey School of Public Affairs, and the Human Rights Program. I would like to thank my colleague and friend Bruno Chaouat, who has been integral in planning and the organization of this event. Our guests from out of town, Gunther, Jikeli, Ken Marcos, welcome to Minnesota. And also Dean Schwartz, thank you for agreeing to present in this panel. We're honored to have you. Patricia, thank you again. And without further ado, I will turn it over to you.
I'm delighted to see all these people here. And I'm going to keep this very brief because the panelists have a lot of very interesting things to say, as I discovered over lunch. When the Jewish grocery store was attacked in the wake of the Charlie Hebdo assault, it was labeled as another brutal act of anti-Semitism. But in what way was it anti-Semitic? In other words, is there anything that sets it apart from the anti-Semitism of the past? Is the anti-Semitism that is evident once more in Europe, and indeed elsewhere, just another manifestation of the anti-Judaism that David Nuremberg argues is built into the structure of Western tradition? Or is there a political dimension that sets it apart? Of the many threads that make up anti-Semitism, two of the most significant are religion and politics. Not only are they woven closely into the fabric of today's anti-Semitism, but they're also often very difficult to distinguish. Even more problematic is the elision of anti-Semitism with a condemnation of present-day Israeli politics with a regard to the Palestinians. And I advisedly don't use the term anti-Zionism. To be sure, for some commentators, the two are indistinguishable, but eliding them can also be a way of silencing individuals, activists, and politicians who have genuine problems with Israel's politics but do not qualify as anti-Semites. The problem of anti-Semitism in Europe is compounded by the large Muslim populations residing in many European countries. It becomes easier silently to condone anti-Semitic activity while blaming Muslim rage at Israel. Added to this, the nativism that has always been just below the surface in many European societies, only to emerge at opportune political moments, has received a boost with a very serious problem posed by the massive wave of migrants that are trying to enter Europe today. In the hands of nativists, anti-migrant sentiment can become a very elastic concept, incorporating a variety of xenophobic and racist discourses. This brings me to the final point that I have time to make, and that is the question of discourse. Stephen Veller, in his 2015 brief introduction to anti-Semitism, takes issue with the linguistic term and the fact that so much of the analyses of the problem take place on a discursive level. This, he argues, provides extensive discussion of terms rather than interpretive efforts of explanation, which serve to eliminate historical responsibility. It's worth thinking about. I shall stop there, although I've touched on only some of the very many questions that come to mind when thinking of anti-Semitism, and today's anti-Semitism in particular. I look forward to hearing what our panelists have to say, and to what I'm sure will be a very lively discussion that follows. And I'm going to introduce our first speaker, that's Kenneth Marcus, who graduated from Williams College, magna cum laude, and obtained his law degree from UC Berkeley School of Law. He's now president and general counsel of the Louis de Brandeis Center for Human Rights under Law, and the author of The Definition of Antisemitism, published by Oxford University Press last year, 2015. And Jewish Identity and Civil Rights in America, published by Cambridge Press in 2010. He founded the Brandeis Center in 2011 to combat the resurgence of anti-Semitism in American higher education. In 2012, he was named to the Forward 50, the Jewish Daily Forward's listing of the American Jews who made the most significant impact on the news in the past year. He has served as staff director at the United States Commission on Civil Rights and has held the Lily and Nathan Ackerman Chair in Equality and Justice in America at the Bernard Rachrath School of Public Affairs in New York. Before entering public service, he was a litigation partner in 2 major law firms. He's published widely in academic journals as well as in more popular venues such as the Jerusalem Post, Commentary, the Weekly Standard, and the Christian Science Monitor. And he's also served as the associate editor of the Journal for the Study of Antisemitism. Please welcome.
Thank you all. Thank you, Alejandro and Patricia. It's wonderful to be back. This is actually my second time at the University of Minnesota this academic year, so it has been a treat for me. Always a pleasure to see old friends and new ones as well. Many topics here, and it is, I think, somewhat extraordinary that this is a topic that is at once pregnant with theoretical and philosophical challenges, and on the other hand, an issue that is very much on the front page of today's Minnesota Daily, that is to say, debates over what is anti-Semitism in Europe, in America, here in Minneapolis and elsewhere, the topic in part of a resolution that was before the student government. So very much a timely issue. I'd like to contribute a little bit in terms of the question, what is it we talk about, or what is it that we should be talking about when we discuss anti-Semitism? Patricia indicated perhaps a few of the interesting questions. The meaning of anti-Semitism has been in dispute for quite some time over many different issues. Recently, of course, the question of where is the line, if any, between anti-Semitism and criticism of Israel. But there are many other issues. Is it appropriate, for instance, to speak of anti-Semitism as the oldest or longest hatred, one extending to the Middle Ages, to the early church, to Hellenic Egypt, depending on the history? Or do we say, following Hannah Arendt, that it is a 19th century ideology, a modern movement, in the words of another of the scholars Patricia mentioned? And then there's the question of whether we should be focused on language and discourse, or whether that absolves of responsibility. Many times people ask me, as a practitioner, is this anti-Semitic, is that anti-Semitic? And what they want to know is this person an anti-Semite? I mean, one of the debates on many college campuses, including this one, has been if someone argues for a particular opposition to Israel, is that anti-Semitic or not? And usually my response is, that's not the best way of framing the question. I think that government agencies, especially in Europe with the European Union Monitoring Center, beginning about a dozen years ago, properly started developing definitions of anti-Semitism that are framed based on conduct rather than mental states. The notion is that if we are simply asking the question, are you an anti-Semite? Are you an anti-Semite? The finger pointing, the accusations, the aspersion really doesn't get us where we need to go, especially if what we're trying to accomplish is either data gathering or understanding levels of problems or law enforcement or government regulation. And so the push has been away from asking, what is in this individual's heart? Are you an anti-Semite because you support this resolution? Instead asking, can we identify that certain kinds of conduct and including certain forms of discourse are anti-Semitic, regardless of what's in the heart or minds of the speaker. It is a real challenge. It is a real challenge because I think that Baer is right to say that if you focus on the discourse, you are absolving someone of responsibility. That is to say, if we say that the real issue is he an anti-Semite, but rather is a certain way of discussing either the Jewish community or the state of Israel, does that advance certain stereotypes or defamation, certain tropes that are harmful? If you do that, then yes, one of the implications is that someone may be advancing anti-Semitism in the sense that they are advancing stereotypes, defamation, so on, and it doesn't matter what's in their heart. And that can absolve them of responsibility. But what I've argued is that institutions like the European Union Monitoring Center, the U.S. Department of State, which has followed it with the State Department definition of anti-Semitism, are right to do so. Because most of the time, as practitioners, when we look at what is happening in a certain place, it is less important to ask, is this person responsible, than it is to ask, do we have a problem? Do we have a problem in this workplace, on this campus, in this country? Nowhere is this more central than in debates over Israel. Because in debates over Israel, we continually get a bifurcation of two sides, asking the question, is this group, the BDS group, or this particular organization, are they anti-Semitic when they say X, when they say Y, when they say Z? And it seems to me that in the greatest number of contexts that we deal with, to know what someone has in their heart is much less important than to know whether an environment is created, regardless of personal intent, which is hurtful or harmful for particular individuals. There are perhaps a small number of empirical studies on the correlation between anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism, which tend to show that even among people who deny that they have negative attitudes towards Jews, they seem to sincerely believe that they are not anti-Semitic in their heart. That those who have negative attitudes towards Israel are much more likely to have negative attitudes towards Jews, even if they deny so. Not only that, but the stronger their negative attitudes towards Israel, the more likely that they have strong negative attitudes towards Jews, even if they deny that as well. So there is a correlation there, although it's not a perfect correlation. That is to say, every study shows that there are some people who have very, very strong negative attitudes towards Israel who do not have negative attitudes towards Jews. It is simply not the case that all people who feel negatively disposed towards Israel, even very strongly negatively disposed towards Israel, many of them simply have no negative attitudes towards Jews. In their minds, it's totally different. The challenge, from the point of view of any sort of, practical analysis, is to figure out not, is this particular person in this category or the other, but rather what is happening to an environment when certain kinds of language are being used. One more piece that I would want to get into is this question of anti-Semitism and hate in different elements of society. There's a question of, on the right, globally, we often see anti-Semitism associated with nativist or nationalist movements. On the left, we see it with some progressive extreme groups. We also see it elsewhere in jihadi. People ask me often when I look at universities, is contemporary anti-Semitism primarily a product of the left? And it seems to me that much of the time one can't tell. One can't always tell with whether it's with the swastikas or with some of the defamations. One doesn't always know the ideology. There's no question that disproportionately on American college campuses, where there are incidents brought to our attention that have an ideological quality to it, it is more on the left today than on the right, and that is somewhat of a shock to those of us who historically have associated hate more with extreme right-wing left-wing movements than with left. What I have made of that is that we see it with extremes in every direction. We see hate with extremes of every direction, and the reason why it appears that anti-Semitism is more associated with the extreme left than with the extreme right on college campuses is that there are far more campuses that have an organized left-wing group than that have organized right-wing group. So we see it on the extremes. But even that, it seems to me, is letting ourselves off a little bit too easily, because that suggests that hate is something that exists only on the extremes. Patricia mentioned Nuremberg, and I think one of the disconcerting findings from some of his work is that one can find some fairly profound anti-Semitism in very central institutions of Western culture. It is not just at the margins, it is not just at the extremes, it is really at the foundations. What I think what we're seeing is that it is only at certain extremes where it is less covered up. That is to say, in the center, in more refined or cultured aspects of the society, we are less likely to speak explicitly in derogatory terms, and more likely to speak in coded terms. Less likely, perhaps, to be conscious of certain forms of hate, and more likely to have implicit biases, which have been found in various of the psychological literature. So what I believe the situation is that we are seeing it pervasively, left, center, and right, jihadi to nativist, and really at the groundwork or center of our culture. And it is just that in certain areas we are covering it up more successfully than in other areas. All of this has certain implications for what we do about it, although they're somewhat complex to tease out. I think the Dean will speak more towards policy than I will. But I'd say just a couple of things briefly about it. Much of the work that we do in addressing anti-Semitism is about covering it up. That is to say, is about addressing the explicit forms and making them implicit. About taking the points at which it surfaces and pushing it under the surface. About regulating it as opposed to eliminating it. And that's often the best that we can do. And I think it's appropriate to spend a significant part of our efforts on regulating as opposed to eliminating it. But I also think that the long-term approach to the question, what can we do about it, has to do more than just that. Has to ask questions about what are the sources and origins so that we can do more than simply dealing with it in particular places where it pops up and asking the question of how can we move to the point where it isn't popping up in the first place. Thank you.
Our next speaker is Gunther Jikeli, who received his PhD at the Technical University of Berlin in 2011, and is at present assistant professor and Justin M. Drew Family Scholar at the Institute for the Study of Contemporary Antisemitism in the Born's Jewish Studies program at Indiana University. He's the author or co-author of 5 books, which include Muslim Antisemitism in Europe, Why Young Urban Males Say They Don't Like Jews, 2014, and Strategies and Effective Practices for Fighting Antisemitism Among Peoples with a Muslim or Arab Background in Europe, 2007. In 2013, he was awarded the Raoul Wallenberg Prize in Human Rights and Holocaust Studies. Please welcome.
Thank you very much, Patricia, for this wonderful introduction. Thank you, Alejandro, for inviting me and putting this all together with Bruno, if I understand correctly. Thank you very much. I think this is an important discussion we're going to have here. And
I just want to, I was asked to give you a little bit of an overview in European countries how anti-Semitism plays out today, and I will take 5 examples. Then we will see that we have really looked into the details to get to a better understanding, because Europe is quite diverse, and also how anti-Semitism shows up there is quite diverse. But before I do so, I really would like to recommend again Ken Marco's book, because it's very timely to discuss what do we understand, how do we understand anti-Semitism. And this book, what the strength of this book is, it really discusses the different approaches. So even if you don't agree with Ken's conclusions, it is very helpful to see what kind of arguments are put out for which kind of definitions, in starting from what really is it? Is it an attitude, anti-Semitism? Is it a behavior? Is it an ideology? And so on. So I really can recommend this book, which is useful for scholars, but not only for scholars. And it also has a very nice cover. And then Patricia asked the question, what has changed? And she started with the kosher supermarket, and the attack on the kosher supermarket, the killing of Jews in the kosher supermarket. And we see, and maybe it's also part of the reason why we are discussing more and more anti-Semitism in Europe. Recently, there are some changes, and of course, some of the changes are in the radical violence of anti-Semitic attacks that are quite new. So the violent jihadist attacks against Jewish schools, Jewish synagogues, Jewish museums, supermarkets, and so on. There's a spiral of violence since 2003, I would say. There is also a rise of anti-Semitic incidents, attacks, and general violence on the streets against Jews since the year 2000. And we have some statistics from some countries where we can really see that there's up to 10 times the number of anti-Semitic incidents if we compare the 1990s to the years after 2000. And something which has also been addressed, which I would like to put out in general, the question of anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism is an important, but as we would see, not in all the European countries. In some countries it does not play a role, but in those countries where it does play a role, whatever your take on or views on Israel are, if there's a general accusation, for example, in France, this is very strong, if the Jewish state, Israel, is demonized, if there's an image that that this is an evil state, if there's a belief that this is not a legitimate state, if Zionist has become an insult in some circles, then if there is a general accusation against all Jews, whatever their view on Israel is, so there's a general accusation, and that plays out very negatively. So Jews get affected negatively and attacked even physically, directly for these anti-Zionist beliefs. And we might come to the discussion afterwards in that what could the term anti-Zionism really mean if we take that as this term seriously. So discussions about terms, I think, are very important for our debates here. So let me give you, in the remaining 6 minutes,
a bit more.
Good, very good. An overview about Hungary, Poland, the UK, France, and Germany. So very different countries. In Hungary, you might know that today we have the party in power is from the far right, and so that the Fidesz party, and there's also the Jobbik party, which is very openly anti-Semitic, or less tending to be neo-Nazi, And these are very strong political forces in Hungary. The discussions in Hungary and why even the United States has been involved in some of the discussions there about anti-Semitism is very much about revisionism, so the view of the Holocaust. And this is, for Europe, a very important thing in all countries. Europe is today a post-Holocaust, or are post-Holocaust societies. And some of them, like Germany, are post-Nazi societies. So what does it mean? It often means that the national identity has come to terms with this past. And in the case of Hungary, there is now what we see with these parties from the extreme right. There is an attempt to celebrate former collaborators with the Nazi regime who were directly implicit in the killing of Jews. And Hungary has not a very good history in that. There were about 850,000 Jews rounded up, forced into ghettos, and many of them deported, and that with the active help of Hungarian policemen, soldiers, and volunteers. So there were about 150 SS people who were sent by the Nazis to organize that, and they were helped by about 200,000 of these policemen, volunteers, soldiers of Hungarian origin. And also what has largely neglected until very recently is the implication of the Hungarian army in the Soviet Union in the mass killings of Jews there. There is very recently a book came out by Christian Ungvari who addresses this issue, but it has largely been neglected in the Hungarian society. So what they do is try to establish statues of some of the figures who were involved in the Nazi collaboration and actively supporting discriminatory action against Jews, like Bali and Thoman. There was sponsored by the Fidesz party and by the local mayor in a small town. They wanted to erect a statue there for Bali and Thoman, and as I said, that was sponsored by the Fidesz party and interestingly by the then Minister of Justice, Tibor Navracsics, who is now EU Commissioner for Education, Culture and Sport. So they wanted to celebrate a former collaborator with the Nazis, but only after international protest that was halted. We also, interestingly, you might know the film The Son of Soul. I know that Bruno saw this film. The Son of Soul is a film that deals with the Holocaust, and interestingly is now the discussion in Hungary about this film, because this film won many prizes, international prizes, and this is viewed critical in Hungary now, and there are anti-Semitic discourses about it that this is only because it is about the Jews, and the Jews are behind it. So there are conspiracy theories now about this film, although it could be celebrated in Hungary as a Hungarian film, which critically, at least in some part, deals with this part of the national history. And then we have also, of course, we can look into surveys. We have surveys that say, for example, consistently since 2011, by the way, that 70%, around 70% of the population in Hungary think that Jews have too much power in business. So 70% of the Hungarian population think that Jews have too much power in business. There are about 10 to 15,000 Jews in Hungary. And I'll come to the next country. There's still this old trope that there's the view that the Jews are responsible for the killing of Jesus. So 30% of the population in Hungary, also consistently over some years, think that this would be the case. They hold the Jews responsible for the killing of Christ. And so we have these very old stereotypes, and we see that also in other countries. They are not dead, they are still somehow there and influential. And in Poland is a very Catholic country. This stereotype, for example, is higher. There's even 40% of the Polish population think that the Jews are responsible for the killing of Christ, which, by the way, is a very strong belief. Yeah, I don't know if you're believers or not, but if it's part of your belief that there's another group who killed your God, they must be very powerful and evil. And in Poland, there's a similar debate on the national history. Very recently, there has been debate about Jan Gross. Jan Gross is an American-Polish professor. He published a number of books, among them a book on the pogroms in Jedwabne in 1941, so before the Germans, also not before, but with the active, with a very active part of the Polish population in the pogroms, anti-Jewish pogroms in Jedwabne, and also another book, Fear and Kielce, after the Second World War, when the Nazis were gone. There was another pogrom in Kielce that showed that there was also antisemitism that was not coming from the Nazis, but from the Polish population. And he won a prize, but this prize, the newly elected government, the far-right party, Law and Justice, they are discussing how to take this prize back from Jan Gross. And they want, they're discussing a law that if somebody says that, or makes references to the Polish death camps, that you can get in prison for it for some years, because that were Nazi death camps on Polish territory. But you see how these debates, and we might go a bit more into that a little bit later, are still vibrant, and often then in these debates antisemitism comes up. Right, I only have 1 or 2 minutes left, okay? So very quickly to the UK. In the UK, these classical anti-Semitic stereotypes are not so strong. What is very strong is anti-Zionism. And that has this effect that Jews feel very much in many contexts, feel accused in a generalized way, that they feel alienated and discriminated, and often have to leave, for example, unions where the anti-Zionist movement is very strong. And also we have a rise of anti-Semitic incidents in the UK. The last year was about 924 anti-Semitic incidents, and almost 100 of them violent anti-Semitic incidents. In France, we have similar statistics. Last year, about 800 incidents, and 200 of them violent. And we have also good surveys there that say that almost half of the Jewish population in France has been insulted several times, or often because they're Jewish, in the last 12 months. And 32% said that they have been attacked several times, or often because they are Jewish. So these numbers are staggering. So that means the experience is very strong there. So Germany, I have no time to go into Germany, but this is a mixture of all of that. And this is also has something to do with the post-Nazi society we have there, that people still want to see, when they know that the Nazis, that many Germans were implicit in the killing of Jews, there is a wish often to say, well, today the Jews are not better than the Nazis, and we have often these analogies and parallels where people think that Israel today would be the same as Nazis and would be calling for genocide, which is of course nonsense if we think about it for 2 minutes. I did not speak about the background of the perpetrators. We have different perpetrators, so from the far right, also from the far left, but also among Muslim populations. In France, for example, it's about more than half of the perpetrators of the anti-Semitic incidents are coming from Muslim communities. Thank you.
We're not actually going in the order on the program, so our next speaker is going to be Bruno Chaouat, and he's Professor of French and Jewish Studies and the Chair of the Department of French and Italian here at the university. He's also Honorary Fellow of the Center for the Study of Jewish Culture, Society and Politics at Durham University. He's the author of Chemin par Morceau, Chateaubriand, 4 edited volumes and numerous articles on French thought from the 19th century to the present. His most recent book, to appear with Liverpool University Press, engages with the French intellectual and literary responses to the new anti-Semitism. His present interests include French debates concerning Jews in France, the memory and representation of the Holocaust, and the impact of the Middle East conflict in literature and theory. He's currently working on a book of intellectual, literary, and cultural history entitled Morose Thought, which focuses on the traumatic memories of World War II and the collaboration in French thought, and ends with an analysis of the different literary and philosophical responses to his perception of the malaise in liberal democracy. Join me in welcoming Bruno.
Thank you, Patricia. Thank you for being here. Thank you so much, Alejandro, for materializing this idea. I focus today on the dialectic between Neo-Nationalism and radical Islam, and how that dialectic affects our thinking about anti-Semitism and the place of the Jews in Europe in general, and more specifically in France today. To that end, I want to present a sociological analysis first and a fable second. At the end of my presentation, the sociological analysis may reveal itself to be the fable, and the fable, the sociological analysis. First then, the sociological analysis. In the aftermath of the attacks on Charlie Hebdo and the Hypercacher grocery in Paris, sociologist Emmanuel Todd published a demographic study of the popular response to terrorism. Todd focused on the sociological and the cultural background. There's a part, it's too, okay. Of the large population, millions of people that paid tribute to the victims of Charlie Hebdo by taking to the streets on January 14, 2015. Insofar as Todd's methodology and results have been, in my view, compellingly contested by social scientists, I believe that it's more useful to focus on his insights and on his blunders than it is to join those who have questioned his empirical method. Emmanuel Todd's purpose was to question the Je suis Charlie, I am Charlie consensus, and to suggest that reactionary, racist, and Islamophobic forces underlie the support for the satirical weekly. Todd's book is best characterized as a manifesto against Islamophobia and against the French neo-secularism supposedly haunted by a racist and an anti-Semitic unconscious. Todd's theory can be summed up as follows. The France that took to the streets on January 15 was reactionary and racist France. The France that today supports secularism is the same sociologically as the France that stood against Dreyfus and that supported the Vichy regime. That France, Todd has labeled with contempt zombie Catholic. For Todd, a zombie Catholic France was marching in support of a xenophobic journal whose main feature is to lampoon the oppressed Muslim minority. Todd defines zombie Catholicism as, and I quote, the anthropological and social force born out of the ultimate disintegration of the church in its traditional strongholds, end quote. Following this disintegration of the church, anti-clerical France, bereft of an adversary, found in Islam the ideal scapegoat. And I quote, the demonization of Islam responds to the intrinsic need felt by a radically de-Christianized society, end quote. So you see, Todd's reasoning, his tendentious science notwithstanding, is interesting, I think, as pure theoretical speculation. It is not inept, I would say, to argue that the confused and disoriented French post-Catholic population, deprived of an adversary and therefore having run out of dialectical steam, needs to find a substitute to channel its bereavement. To be fair, Todd's analysis, if overall perverse, proves at times rather insightful. Todd, for one thing, is not a denier of the new anti-Semitism. He stresses the indifference of secular France, what he calls zombie Catholic France, to Muslim anti-Semitism, and he notes the disproportion between the massive reaction, grief and outrage to the murder of atheist militants, Charlie Hebdo journalist, and the quasi-absence of reaction within that same France to the murder of Jewish children in Toulouse in 2012, or even at the kosher grocery 2 days after the Charlie attacks. This is not, I think, a trivial observation. This is one that certainly deserves pondering. However, Todd's contrarianism carries him away, makes him call for return to religion, to revive an authentic republican egalitarianism. Islam, or what he calls a zombie Islam, would be the only alternative to Western nihilism. Indeed, unlike Judaism, Islam proselytizes and it represents the only vibrant and the only growing faith today. Thus, Islam would be a cure to a fragmented, atomized, selfish, individualistic postmodernity. A return to a holistic society based on a stable social order would be a way of fighting, he argues, the new anti-Semitism, French and European metaphysical anxiety, and the existential emptiness of zombie Catholic France. Moreover, Todd's juvenile penchant for paradox leads him to blame Charlie for Islamic anti-Semitism. Here is his reasoning. If there had been no attack on Islam by Charlie Hebdo and zombie Catholic France, no Muslims would use Jews as scapegoats for their frustration, an altogether indefensible and disingenuous proposition which takes no account of anti-Semitism within Islam. So contrarianism and juvenile provocation aside, Todd has something of an enfant terrible and of a charming rebel teenager. He rightly notes the troubling indifference to the new anti-Semitism, a new anti-Semitism that he situates among the Muslim population, all the while explaining it by oppression, relegation, humiliation, and racism. And the silence of that France is deafening zombie Catholic France. Todd accurately highlights the objective alliance between the new, let's say, Muslim and the old post-Catholic anti-Semitism. Interestingly, he does not identify the far right as the other pole of that alliance, but instead the France of Charlie. Todd analyzes this as a chain reaction. The alleged Islamophobia of zombie Catholic France supposedly generates Muslim anti-Semitism. His blind spot, and it's a serious one at that, I think, consists in not realizing that if zombie Catholic France does not mobilize against Islamic anti-Semitism, it is not because Islamophobia, because Islamophobia, would be the new anti-Semitism. It is not, I would argue, because somehow the January procession was at once unconsciously anti-Semitic and Islamophobic. Rather, it is because France is ambivalent about the revival of Islam. It is at once petrified and hypnotized by the allure of a strong faith that promises restoration of transcendence and spirituality to a civilization that seems to have lost both. Such is the subject of Michel Houellebecq's latest literary provocation to the fable. Houellebecq's novel, Soumission, Submission, came out a few months before Todd, Who is Charlie? It is a known fact that the book coincidentally appeared in bookstores the day of the Charlie tragedy. Todd's theory would resonate well with Houellebecq's character, François, a Sorbonne literary scholar who specializes in and to some extent identifies with French decadent novelist Joris Karl Huysmans, who came to reaffirm the Catholicism he had abandoned in the late 19th century. If Todd's categorization means anything at all, I would suggest that François is a personification of zombie Catholic France. François ends up converting to Islam for pragmatic reasons and because he fails to be touched by a Catholicism definitely dead for him. Rather than dismissing Houellebecq's novel as Islamophobic, Emmanuel Todd should have read it more closely. Submission contains an allegory of Todd's theory and perhaps of Todd's own destiny. Moreover, Houellebecq's novel highlights the resurgence of anti-Semitism and the absence of a future for French Jews caught in a vice between zombie Catholic resignation, Muslim anti-Semitism, and the rise of European populism. Submission rests on a simple plot. In 2022, France holds a runoff presidential election against the backdrop of a brewing civil war between white supremacists and Muslim jihadists. The leader of the far-right party, Marine Le Pen, is faced with an adversary of an unprecedented kind, at least in French politics. He is Mohamed Ben Abbès, the charismatic and imaginary leader of a new Islamic party. François detachedly observes the sea change in French and indeed European politics as Ben Abbès wins the election and thereby ends decades of boring electoral alternation between right and left. Brainwashed by the president of the now Islamic Université de la Sorbonne, Robert Rédigé, François converts to Islam. With his several wives, Rédigé has obviously had no problem accommodating himself to Islam's sexism. He is, moreover, quite unconcerned with its anti-Semitism. Houellebecq stages conversion to a moderate and democratic form of Islam, an Islam light, reminiscent of Todd's call for a zombie Islam, as an ironic alternative to European emptiness. And thus goes François' wager. Why not give up one's autonomy and submit to an ideology that is greater than the atomized self and that promises to restore meaning to an absurd world? It's a win-win, like Pascal's wager, all things being equal. Either the God of Islam is real and the convert wins eternity, or he is not and the convert earns several wives, an assailable tenure at the prestigious Sorbonne, and international academic recognition. Islam will free the self from the torment of freedom. A freedom that condemns the postmodern Western individual to be nothing beyond his body, an aging body, tormented by hemorrhoids and migraines, torn apart among trivial consumerist choices, consumed by the repetition of mechanical orgasms, and eaten up by eczema and STDs. You have all Houellebecq in a nutshell here. I'm done? No, I've got 2 minutes. Okay. The rise of Islam in France is, in the novel, the eruption of history into an eventless world, a drop of metaphysics, if you will, in the ocean of materialism. Houellebecq is acutely, yet very aware that Europe has lost all forms of meaning and transcendence, and that a civilization that has abdicated all its traditions is an inoperative, idle civilization, doomed to fall into the abyss of its own emptiness. The establishment of Sharia law in France is thus merely an ironic suggestion of a last-ditch civilizational attempt at overcoming the despair and the affliction of autonomy, material decay, and flat death. Israel is the country to which Miriam, François' only real object of affection, and certainly the only character in the novel that escapes caricature and ridicule, emigrates because of growing anti-Semitism in France. Miriam's adieu to France is a response to the new reality, the post-Toulouse, the post-Ilan Halimi reality. That reality is the rise of Islamic anti-Semitism and the growing fascination of zombie Catholic France with an ideology that promises to restore lost meaning, fill metaphysical emptiness, and repair the loss of transcendence. It offers a spirituality that consumerism and materialist enjoyment can no longer provide, a fascination that is also a resignation. Thank you.
Our last speaker is Eric Schwartz, and he's professor and dean of the Humphrey School of Public Affairs. Schwartz obtained a BA honors degree in political science at SUNY Binghamton and holds a law degree from NYU School of Law, where he was recipient of the Root Tilden Snow Scholarship. He also has a Master of Public Affairs degree from the Woodrow Wilson School of Public and International Affairs at Princeton University. Following his early teaching career, he spent 30 years in senior public service, where he held posts at the United Nations, numerous important NGOs, and other important posts. Prior to coming to Minnesota, he was nominated by President Obama to serve as U.S. Assistant Secretary of State for Population, Refugees, and Migration, where he worked closely with the then Secretary of State, Hillary Clinton. From 2005 to 2007, he served as the UN Secretary. He served at the UN with Secretary General Kofi Annan as Deputy Special Envoy for the Tsunami Recovery. Prior to that, he served as the Deputy UN High Commissioner for Human Rights in Geneva. This is only a very brief list of his many accomplishments and the important posts he has held. So please welcome.
That's an elegant way to say that I can't hold a job. But one position that I currently hold, which is probably more relevant to this panel discussion than a number of the other positions, is I am a commissioner now on President Obama's appointee, an appointee of President Obama to the Commission on International Religious Freedom, which has focused some time and attention on the issue of anti-Semitism. How many students are here? Raise your hand if you're a student. Okay, that's good. I don't think we can have this discussion without ignoring the fact, while ignoring the fact that, and I don't think we have ignored the fact that our students have been deeply engaged over the past many days in a debate about Israel, about policies surrounding the occupation and treatment of Palestinians, about the relation, and I think maybe most significantly for the purposes of this discussion, about the relationship between efforts to bring pressure to bear on the government of Israel and anti-Semitism. I don't think I'm saying anything, revealing anything that anybody here isn't aware of. So let me talk about, just to start the conversation, about what I think should be obvious. That opposition to the policies of the government of Israel in the occupied territory does not constitute anti-Semitism. That opposition to policies that may disadvantage our citizens of Israel does not, ipso facto, by the fact that it is opposition, constitute anti-Semitism. That acknowledging that there are challenging issues challenging issues, tension even, between the ideal of Israel as a democratic state and Israel as a Jewish state that is a haven for the Jewish people. Acknowledging those challenges does not ipso facto constitute anti-Semitism. And I would even say that advocacy of a different political disposition for communities in the region, even what some are advocating, a one-state solution, not a solution that I support, but that others do, that recognizes the rights and well-being of all the people in the region, does not ipso facto constitute anti-Semitism. And that accusations or concerns that such positions do, I think can be a distraction and cloud the discussion and the debate on the critical issues that our panel is discussing. Notwithstanding, I think the important points that have been made about the discourse. So what are we talking about? If I've just articulated what I think we're not talking about. Others on the panel have spoken of a well-described, centuries-old demonization of a people, an ultimate reification of an entire people, a false attribution of power and intentionality that justifies all manner of abuses that could be visited upon these people and that are justified, presumably. And the fact is that bigotry and hatred toward Jews has existed for centuries, well before the political issues and controversies that have occupied the time and attention of this campus over the past many weeks. And whether theologically based or not, this hatred is a tool for demagogues who seek political power, and in the case of Europe, who offer simple and coherent solutions, or apparently coherent solutions, confronting European societies that are changing very rapidly and in an environment of considerable uncertainty, an environment that is ripe for demagoguery, for anti-Semitism, for hatred. So what's the answer? What's the answer? And I don't know. I don't know what the answer is, but let me articulate some ideas from maybe the perspective of policy. I think first there is the critical issue of leadership. Our public officials have to speak out often and at the highest levels against expressions of hate, expressions of bigotry against Jews. Just by way of example, and there are others, the statements made by our United Nations ambassador, Samantha Power, at the OSCE's 2014 Conference on Anti-Semitism, provide to me a pretty good example. She made the obvious yet important point about symbolic expressions of concern at things like OSCE conferences. And she said, and I quote, when leaders show up, nations take notice. And she took the time to talk about the history of anti-Semitism, about the November 1938 paroxysm of violence at Kristallnacht, prelude to the Holocaust. She spoke about the extraordinary percentage of European Jews who were subjected to anti-Semitic harassment or violence, how Jews who make up such a tiny percentage of France's population were the victims of an extraordinary percentage of attacks based on race, on religion, on ethnicity. And importantly, she also talked about what I think we can call a toxic mixture, in which political and human rights concerns are debased with anti-Semitism and anti-Semitic rhetoric. as, for example, when protesters in Germany of the Israeli attacks in Gaza were heard chanting Hamas, Hamas, Jews to the gas. So leaders have to stand up. They have to stand up, as, for example, Chancellor Merkel has done when she said that Jewish life belongs to us. It's part of our identity and part of our culture. I think leadership also means a commitment to sustained vigilance, as reflected in the position in the U.S. government of a U.S. envoy to combat and to monitor anti-Semitism. I'm not certain whether other governments have established similar positions, but it seems to me that efforts to establish a coalition of senior officials internationally who come together to focus attention on these issues and who are empowered by their own national governments is an idea that should be pursued. In her comments, Samantha made another point that I believe is relevant today and to the times that we're experiencing, that increased expressions of anti-Semitism can often coexist with a greater degree of political intolerance generally. And while anti-Semitism is regrettably ever present, it can certainly become more pervasive in environments in which civility, dialogue, and respect for all peoples is diminished. And for this reason, leaders, for example, in our own country, who call for the barring of Muslims, not only diminish from the United States, not only diminish their own credibility and our own credibility in the international effort to combat anti-Semitism and all forms of intolerance, but perpetrate a climate that tolerates discrimination and prejudice generally. So this can't be effective in the fight against anti-Semitism. Conversely, when leaders here in the United States articulate a vision for an inclusive society, we enhance our capacity to combat anti-Semitism and all forms of intolerance. And of course, with respect to groups like ISIS and its fellow travelers, the fight against anti-Semitism is also part of a broader worldwide battle of ideas in which groups like ISIS, in their use of social media and other means of communication, offer an apocalyptic vision of world conflict and, of course, reject any notion of the compatibility of Islam and other traditions. At its very best, our traditions, right here in the United States, of welcoming the stranger, of sustaining a commitment to diversity and inclusion, is a highly effective rebuke of that preposterous notion of the incompatibility of Islam and other traditions, and offers a model not only for governments around the world, but for people, for Muslims, for Christians, for Jews. Conversely, giving in to leaders who promote intolerance and bigotry risks playing into the very narrative that we're trying to combat worldwide. So let me make one other point. Let me make one other point on the geopolitical effort to combat anti-Semitism. But let me be very careful with this point, because I don't want it to be misconstrued. Let me first emphasize that challenges and failure to move forward on the peace process in the Middle East is not, cannot be seen as a rationale or a justification in any way, in any shape, in any manner, or any form for hatred of Jews. For hatred of Jews as Jews. That is, for anti-Semitism. Moreover, and regrettably, a Middle East peace will not rid the world of the scourge of anti-Semitism. At the same time, when you are in a battle against hate, such as this battle, recognition of reality is important as you develop tactics to determine how to achieve your objectives. And there's no question in my mind that progress toward a Middle East peace, important in and of itself, could also help to deprive anti-Semites of at least one weapon they have wielded in their unsavory campaign to vilify Jews. Finally, I believe that this isn't the job for governments alone. That leaders of all faiths must talk with one another and critically within their own communities about prejudice and anti-Semitism. Writing in the New Statesman, the journalist Mehdi Hassan writes, and I quote, "The truth is that the virus of anti-Semitism has infected members of the British Muslim community, both young and old. No, the ongoing Israel-Palestine conflict hasn't helped matters, but this goes beyond the Middle East," end quote. Hassan expounds on this in some detail, but the point, I think, is that efforts to combat anti-Semitism cannot be addressed solely by governments. Communities, leaders in communities, in Muslim communities, have to come to grips with these issues and deal with them. And before I close, let me also note, of course, that our law enforcement communities must be assiduous in protecting Jewish communities and in acting strongly and swiftly in response to expressions of hate. This is indeed a very, very challenging time in light of a confluence of world events. But I'm an optimist, and I think that with inspired, genuine political leadership and just a bit of political courage, tough times can be skillfully and effectively managed to ensure a brighter future, not only for Europe's Jews, but for all of those who may be victims of hate. Thank you.
Well, I think we have some time for questions. I'm afraid I don't have all your names, so I shall rudely point to you. Yes?
I have two questions. I don't know who's best to address them. And the first question had to deal with the ability of Europe, specifically dividing up Western Europe and Eastern Europe in terms of dealing with their role in the Holocaust. Excuse me, sorry, Gunther. I apologize, Professor. I had the pleasure of taking a synagogue trip to Eastern Europe, I think it was last year, or the year before, last year. And we were in Hungary. And the government itself the government in power seems to really encourage denying its role in the Holocaust. I don't know how they get by with it, considering they were allies of them. And yet, right in the main square, right near their parliament, is this huge statue showing, oh, we were victims of the Nazis. Do you know which one I'm talking about? I don't know the name of the statue. And yet there seems to be, a lot of the people I met are sitting there going, yeah, no, that wasn't the case. So there seems to be a conflict going on, and yet I don't know what forces they seem to be winning, seem to be succeeding. There are my limited exposure. I mean, I talked to a couple of the rabbis there who said, yeah, they only recognize like the very Orthodox. The government recognizes certain religions, I guess, in terms of getting support. In Poland, we met the head of the Krakow JCC who said, yeah, it's really, everybody blames Poland for their participation in the Holocaust. We were here for 1,000 years. It really would have been that. His logic was, of course, he was miserable. And his logic was that he said, if it was that bad, would we have stayed? Which isn't actually, that's anecdotal, obviously. But anyway, I wanted you to address that, or somebody to address that. Just in terms of the different perspectives. Everybody I talked, the groups that I socialize with, they all said, oh, Poland bad, Germany bad, the whole thing. Everybody likes to blame everybody. But I'm lacking information in terms of that. So how does Eastern and Western, and do they differ in terms of the responsibility, the recognition of participation? it gets into perpetrators and that. So I don't know who can best answer that.
Yeah, thank you for this question. Yes, they differ very much. I mean, not only West and former Eastern European countries, also the difference between Poland and Hungary is big. In Hungary, you're right, I read recent surveys that about half of the population do think that also the Hungarian population was helping in the Holocaust, in the killing of Jews. So they do acknowledge, they know that there was an implicit, that their politicians, Hungarians, were involved in the mass killings of Jews. But you have this statue that was, or has been supported by Viktor Orban, the leader of the far-right party in power, that portrays Hungary as an angel attacked by the German eagle.
Right.
So it's a huge statue. And this is something similar to what we can see in Austria. In Austria, there's still this view that Austrians were the first victims of Nazi Germany, which is of course untrue. So they portray themselves as victims and deny the role of perpetrators. This is still, so many years afterwards, a debate. But the positive thing is that in this country, particularly in Poland, there is a debate about it. Poland is it's a very specific case because Polish people suffered immensely by the German occupation. Yeah, they were killed in millions as well, non-Jewish Poles. But also the Polish Jewish population, there were 3 million Polish Jews, and now there are 5,000. And most of them were killed in the death camp by the Nazis, with only some help by the Polish. But there was and is still anti-Semitism in Poland. But the good thing is there is a debate about it. Now the far right is in power, and so they have more revisionist views. But there is a debate within Poland, and even, I mean, some of these cities, there were 30% of the population was Jewish, right? And so there is really a lack of the, I mean, part of the heritage is gone, and Poles do search now for this heritage, and they celebrate. They have Jewish cultural weeks, and their klezmer concerts, and often there's not a single Jew, but they celebrate. It's sometimes a bit funny how that works out, but it's not necessarily of a negative sentiment, of course. It's a search. I see it as a search for this heritage. But still, you have been maybe on these markets. There are a lot of these open markets, and you can find these wooden figures. And a lot of these figures there's then the Jew with a gold bag, and so very stereotypical anti-Semitic figures, Jew with a long nose and so on. So you still have that, but it's not, most people and even many Jewish tourists coming to Poland don't find that really harmful, but there are anti-Semitic stereotypes in the society very strongly, so has played out. I don't know if that answers your question.
I'm not even sure I asked a good question, but I just wanted to address the issue, in terms of...
just one thing to add to this, the distinction which is quite puzzling between the West and the East in Europe. Seems like in the Eastern part of Europe, in some countries, that there is a denial, sort of institutional and state denial of the past, while it's the exact opposite in Western Europe, certainly in France, for that matter, to the point that some intellectuals have talked about a cult and a culture of repentance when it comes to the Holocaust, which itself poses certain problems. Hypermnesia or too much memory of the Holocaust can actually trigger some effects of amnesia. So that's a very interesting sort of, and also of denial in a way, of not working through the past.
Because it's hard when you're over there. It's hard to get a sense of it.
But did you have something, Alejandro?
No, I think there were all the questions for
At the back, lady at the back, yes.
So I was very intrigued by a question that you raised about do we understand anti-Semitism in Europe of 1939? Is it the same or different conceptually? about the way we would talk about anti-Semitism today. I thought that was a very important and interesting question. Obviously, there are many kinds of anti-Semitism, religious, social, political, but if we want to historicize it, which I think was what was driving the question and really critical, I would be happy for anyone or all of the panel to respond to the question. Oh, I'd start with Bruno for sure.
Is that serious?
Yes.
You really want to?
I realize you're not a historian, but I should just open it. I think it's a
Well,
very
I think
important
that
question, and
I think that the Pierre-André Taguieff, the sociologist or political the scientist Pierre-André Taguieff has, in a way, historicized it by showing that there is a kind of disruption with the new anti-Semitism. It's no longer racist, quote-unquote, or racial anti-Semitism. It's more anti-racist anti-Semitism. I mean, he's a kind of provocateur, but at the same time, it triggers some kind of truth, you know, to talk about this paradigm shift in the history of anti-Semitism. So what you have when you talk about the extreme left or some, you know, parts of sectors of the extreme left joining into some form of disguised or even not really disguised forms of anti-Semitism, it's not in the name of race. It's not in the name of a pure race or a pure nation. Far from it. It's accusation that the Jews are actually those who are the racists. They are those who want a pure nation, you know, a national sovereignty and borders and so on and so forth. You know what's very interesting in Louis Ferdinand Céline, who is the arch anti-Semite in French literature. In 1940, he was one of the most famous novelists in the French corpus. And in 1940, he was writing pamphlets against Jews. And it's very bizarre because he was at the same time writing in a very racist rhetoric of the time against the Jews and against the blacks, actually, right? So he was writing against them. And at the same time, now and then, pops up a bizarre adjective in his prose, in his anti-Semitic prose. He puts together the words juif, Jew, and racist. And he called the Jews racist. What does that mean in 1940? I don't know. Probably that the Jews are communitarian, that the Jews stick together, that they believe that they are the superior race and so on and so on. And I think what's coming back now is that sort of anti-Semitism.
Sure. So there are a continuum of views. On the one extreme, there is the view that anti-Semitism has lasted for at least hundreds and perhaps thousands of years, but that it has mutated from time to time. Once primarily religious, it changed in nature as a result of changing social circumstances. It became primarily racial in character in the mid-19th century, and that it has mutated again in the late 20th to early 21st century, so that it is no longer primarily racial and it had a more political character. That the reasons for these mutations have to do with adaptation. For Wilhelm Marr in the 1870s, religious bigotry was no longer intellectually sustainable, so it was necessary to give a new scientific footing to continue and strengthen the opposition to the threat that he believed Jews posed, and so there was a change. And then a century later, a change was required again, as racialism became as outmoded as religious bigotry had been. And so a need to put anti-Semitism on yet a new rationale, and therefore the political anti-Semitism in the form of anti-Zionism. That there's one set of narratives at that end. At the other end, there's a view that says that it simply doesn't make much sense to think that what's happening in the 21st century in one city, whether we're talking about Hungary, is the same as what happened in Hellenic Egypt, or the same as in various communities in medieval Europe. That it is true that Jews have been hated to an extraordinary nature in many civilizations and in many times, but that this sort of hatred tends to respond to different circumstances, and that there are different functions that hate served in medieval times and what it serves in modern times, and that if you want to understand why there's a particular hatred in the United States or in Eastern Europe or in any other place, it's not enough just to look at a long hatred. You have to look at the function that anti-Semitism serves in a particular time and place. And so no, you can't say it's really the same. It's different. And then there are all sorts of views in between. My own thought is that both of those extreme views illuminate a set of phenomenon and obscure another. The view of the long hatred enables us to see evolution and change over time, whereas the view that focuses only on specific periods allows us to understand the work done by hatred in particular culture. I believe that there is more of a repetition of hatreds, but that it's different in different times and places because it serves a different set of social needs.
Anybody else want to add to that? No? Yes.
Before you answer your question, if you would be willing, I was wondering what you thought.
Oh. Well, I do think it is very different. I think Ken has spelled out a lot of things. I think one of the things that I feel there is a sort of weaving together of what is happening in the Middle East, and I'm not necessarily focusing on Israel, but just the larger problem of politics in the Middle East. And this is being interpreted in different countries in different ways. And one of the easy ways of singling out people are either either anti-Semitism or anti-Muslim feeling. I do agree with what Ken says that if you can call them values or the factors of hatred are very different in different countries. And I think those factors relate to the values of the particular country. And so in some cases it might be economic, it might be much more political, and it may be a sort of economic situation that triggers it, it may be a political situation that triggers it. So I think with globalization too, the whole thing has become much more complex. Yes. So.
One thing said several times today, which I think is true, is that opposing certain policies of the Israeli government or even promoting the idea of the BDS movement does not make one automatically anti-Semitic. At the same time, those movements become very convenient vehicles for actual anti-Semites to latch onto, whether they do it simply without thinking because it's part of their culture, or whether it's very cynical, very politically motivated activism. Here is a wedge issue that can be used to attack not just Israel, but Jews in general.
Yeah, I think that's right. Yes. There was a question back there. Yes, sir.
Yes. My question is for Dean Schwartz. I recognize, and I'm sure you're well aware, that hate speech, and particularly anti-Semitic hate speech, is treated rather differently in various Western European nations and in the United States, where in the United States it's much more directly protected as free speech. That raises a real question, I think, about the implications for how one deals with the public expressions of anti-Semitism. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that in light of the recommendation that you made concerning the importance of public officials speaking out. In what sense should anti-Semitism be condemned publicly? And in what sense should freedom of expression be protected publicly?
I want to treat your comment as a question, and then I want to treat your question as a question. And let me take yours first, because I think that when you talk about what is in people's hearts, that's a very important issue for sociological understanding. It just is. To know what is motivating people is important in terms of academic inquiry, in terms of understanding social forces, and also really understanding what's going on. Right? And that's been much of the panel discussion. But in the world of policy and in the world of public discourse, it's very difficult to look into people's hearts. And so let's take the BDS movement and let's examine, if I may, I mean, from the statement, is the president's statement's out there. It's out there, so we can talk about it, right? I mean, so let's examine that statement. The statement expresses a general concern about boycotts, awareness about boycotts. Awareness is not an unconditional opposition, but it's awareness for all the reasons they're obvious. And then it makes a statement about the BDS movement. It seems to not make a distinction between opposition to the policies of the government and opposition to the existence. It doesn't make a distinction. Essentially, so it raises questions about the legitimacy of this. And if you look at the BDS, the documents, it's a fair analytical comment about BDS. And the president of the university, like any public official, has a right to express his view of that position, and he did, right? And that's very different than pondering what's in the heart of the people who are behind the BDS movement. And so, as a matter of policy, I think it's a lot easier to make judgments based on the articulated or the stated positions than it is to try to speculate about what's really behind it. Not that speculating on what's really behind it shouldn't inform political decisions that you make. That's different. So I just wanted to make that comment. Now, on your question, that's not a hard issue for me. We have a right and obligation to condemn expressions of anti-Semitism. And there's to me, it's a pretty simple issue. I think leadership involves standing up and saying what you are saying should not be part of the political discourse. I'm not challenging your right to say it, but you should have said it. And it's hateful. It does not move the political discourse forward. It's dangerous, and it's abhorrent, and it should be condemned. I don't have any problem with a public official doing that, and I think if more of our public officials were prepared to do it, we would have a greater impact on some of these issues. But I'm not I know the distinction between the international standards with respect to expression in our own domestic law, and I'm a fan of our own domestic law, because I think line drawing becomes very difficult when you're saying incitement is incitement, but once you get before incitement, I think it's very difficult to say this is okay and that's not okay. So I wouldn't be a big fan of looking to criminalize hate speech, but condemning hate speech, being out there consistently promoting the proposition that our discourse should be civil and civilized, I think our leaders should be doing more of that.
Gunther, next.
Thank you. I would like to comment. I think you're very right. This is not an issue that is really an opposition. In Europe, in many countries, in Germany or France, you can, for like Holocaust denial, you can get to prison, right? But is that really effective? We don't know, because usually people, even if they get to prison, they still can spread out their hatred. Yeah, it's not a done deal. So maybe it's more effective if leaders speak out against it and say, you said that, but it should not be accepted in our how we talk to each other, how we deal with it, and it should be denounced. So certainly just another way of showing this is not acceptable. And I also agree on what you said about the intentions or motivations. We cannot look in people's heads. And part of my research is to try to do so, to understand how anti-Semites think. And my only way to do so is ask them and put questions and analyze what they tell me. But still then, I cannot really look into their heads. But it helps us, hopefully, to get a better understanding about the motivation they potentially have. Then you said something very interesting, and I think this is a broader discussion. The Middle Eastern conflict, even if that would be solved, that would not stop anti-Semitism. And I would even go one step further. We can see, if we compare this to, let's say, Nazi Germany, when there was a lot of hate against the Ostjuden, the Eastern Jews coming to Germany, often very poor. If that would have been solved as a problem, let's say, if they would not have come to Germany, that would not have saved a single Jew. That would have not diminished the Nazi propaganda against Jews. And this is, I think, very similar here. I think it's an illusion to think that if there would be a peace, which is not in sight, unfortunately, now, that this would deprive the anti-Semites, who really are obsessional with Jews, they would find other arguments. Anti-Semites have been very inventive, and that is part maybe of the question you had. If leaders and the public discourse is in a way that certain expressions of anti-Semitic resentment are not allowed, they invent it and find others. But it's still important to keep it at a lower level. And when we see just one last thing, condemnation of Israel is something different from criticism of Israel. So if we take the term anti-Zionism, even in the one-state solution, by the way, as well, I think, regardless of if we label this as anti-Semitic or not, it's a very dangerous idea. If the state of Israel, if the IDF would not exist anymore, you would put not only the 6 million Jews in Israel in danger, but all the 8 million inhabitants in serious danger. So you ignore the threat of genocide, potential genocide, against the people who live there, who have lived there for many, many years. So we should be aware of that.
Two quick points in response to both and to the two questions. First, a lot of the work that I do involves the use of the tools that we need in light of the fact that we cannot look into people's hearts and minds. We don't really know what they're thinking. So I, as a lawyer, am looking at the different tools and mechanisms. But there are times where intellectually it is useful and valuable to know what's in their hearts. And there's a guy who figured out how to do it, and he's sitting next to me. So I just want to say, one of the most amazing academic projects I've seen is sort of the question, how can you figure out whether young Muslim immigrant males in certain European countries are opposed to Israel because of political concerns or because they just hate Jews? And he came up with a brilliant way of figuring it out, which is ask them. and it turns out that if you ask them in a formalized, structured series of interviews in a particular way, in a very serious methodology, they will tell you some stunning things. And so that's incredible. We don't always have that ability to, but he does. And so that's one of the more amazing pieces of research that I've seen recently in Gunther's new work. Second, I agree with everything that Eric said in response to this question, except for the part where he said that it wasn't a hard question, or it was easy. I find it extremely...
Oh, in terms of that?
Yes, I find it extremely, extremely hard. I think that there is a... Well, so the question, as I understand, recall it, is the following. There's a big deviation between American and European responses to hate speech. That's true. I find it shocking, speaking to colleagues in Europe or in Canada or Australia, and they all want to do more to address hate speech than we Americans want to do. And like Eric, I buy into the American consensus and think that we're right and we're the only ones that are right and they're wrong, and I just can't. But I understand the fact that this is our mindset as Americans. If we accept that, and if we take a very strong First Amendment view of speech in public institutions, and if we also want private institutions to act as if they were bound by the First Amendment and to protect the same level of free speech, even though they're not legally required to do so, that leaves lots of difficult questions. Most hate speech is protected speech, but there's lots that isn't. There's hate speech that takes place in what we call non-public fora. So for instance, there are lots of nasty things that you might be able to say about Jews in some contexts, but you can't necessarily carve it into their dorm room door. So there are certain contexts in which you can deal with it, even if you are a First Amendment absolutist, like many of us are. A couple caveats, though. One is, it is astonishing to me how often and how selectively these norms are raised. There are universities that are constantly under attack from FIRE, the Foundation for Individual Rights in Education, for running roughshod on First Amendment rights in many different contexts, and yet very quick to raise the First Amendment when they're asked to address anti-Semitism. My own preference is they should be consistently protective everywhere, but it does make you wonder why the selectivity and the invocation. Second, if we assume that we're not dealing with one of the exceptions to the First Amendment, that there's a public forum involved, that you can't engage in what's called regulatory conduct. You can't prohibit, you can't punish, you can't even regulate certain forms of hate speech. And we say, well, then the answer is you engage in non-regulatory conduct, basically respond to speech with speech. That's still a lot easier said than done. A lot easier than said than done. For instance, there are many different kinds of speech and response, right? There are speeches from the president, there's speeches from lower level officials, there's training, there's orientation, there's a wide array. There are questions in response to particular incidents. Deans and presidents say to me, well, you know what, there was this incident that happened, but I can't issue a statement in response to every hate or bias incident, or I'm not going to do anything but issue statements. And furthermore, if I issue that many statements, it's not going to get through. People are just going to hit delete. It's not going to have its power. So there are tactical questions about when you respond. There are questions about backlash. There are questions of how specific can you be. And then there are a host of other questions. I agreed with everything that you said in your statements. The president, in his statement that came out yesterday, could have said all that, but didn't. And then you can ask the question, well, should he have or should he not have? And I think that's a debatable point, and you can say the pros and cons either way. It is clearly the case that there are many times when hate and bias incidents come up, and it's hard to figure out, do you respond, how do you respond? And then if you do you respond with specificity about this anti-Semitism, or do you bundle it up together with the last 5 incidents that happened to other groups in order to make sure nobody feels like they're excluded, in order to make sure it doesn't look like special pleading, in order to make sure it doesn't get caught up? Or do you say, well, that loses the power of it. You have to respond to particular issues with particularity. That's all my way of saying that as a poor country lawyer, I find that question to be immensely difficult, especially in the bewildering number of incidents in which it happens. My own preference, and it's easier for me to say as someone who is not an administrator of a university, is that it is most effective to be specific, but to realize you just can't respond to all of it, and you can't always be as explicit as we might like to be.
I just want to comment on one thing, and I don't want to be put in the position, and I fear I'm going to be put in the position of defending a position that I don't support, which I don't. I think the reasons you articulated, some of the reasons, not all, but some of the reasons you've articulated, lead me also to think that the way forward in the Middle East is a 2-state solution that reflects the rights and well-being of both communities. But I also believe, and I think you may agree with this, I wasn't sure from your comment, that I'm not prepared to say that support for a 1-state solution in the Middle East, ipso facto, by its fact, by that support, reflects anti-Semitism or hatred and bigotry towards Jews. I'm not prepared to say that, and I think that doesn't mean I don't oppose it. But I think, I'm not prepared to say it reflects anti-Semitism. I'm not prepared to make that definitive statement.
We've got some more questions, but I just wanted to add one thing to your question. You've got to remember that in Europe, and I think that the issues are very different from Europe and the States. In France, 9% of the population is Muslim. In the United Kingdom, I think it's 4.6 or 4.5. In the States, it's 0.04, I think. So when there are anti-Semitic incidents, the governments have to juggle the idea of just how anti-Semitic is it from the Muslim point of view. And there are always those extreme groups who, if the government or if people will take a certain tact about supporting Israel or seem to be supporting people that are being anti-Semitic, that are being against anti-Semitic talk, the Muslims will turn around and say, well, you're being anti-Muslim. So there is a very fine juggling act that has to go on in some of these countries. And I honestly think that some of these leaders haven't figured it out. Yeah, sorry, there was this gentleman here and then that gentleman.
As you try to get into people's heads with various effects, to what extent does envy play a role, both at the individual level and at the state level? It seems to me that a lot of hate talk has a great deal of envy tied into it, in terms of, that's measured in terms of a successful state or a successful individual or successful group of individuals.
I would put it a little bit different, not envy, but projections. Negative projections you might have of yourself, or you might have feelings of some things, and then you think that the Jew, often it's an imaginary Jew, has it all, and then you look for it. So make it a little bit concrete. If what some of the people I interviewed said, I remember one case saying, well, he wanted to be very successful in business, and he was prepared in doing bad things to people who would compete with him, but he knew that there are some limits and he should not kill other people to be successful. Right? And then he was accusing Jews to do so. So there's a clear projection of that, what he wishes to do. But he knows that's not right, so he projects that against Jews and said, all the Jews, that was about 9/11, the conspiracy theory, they had these insurance buildings, and that's why they organized it, that there was the 9/11 terror attacks, and those could claim the insurance money and so on. So these kind of projections rather than envy, but it's related to envy.
There is, if I may just add one thing, there is an interesting parallel with the history of actually Nazi anti-Semitism, the psychology of Nazi, or maybe the metaphysics of Nazi anti-Semitism, and what you are observing in radical groups, Islamic groups today. And this is what historian Burin has actually analyzed as the couple resentment, so that's envy basically, and apocalypse. And I think in both cases of Nazi anti-Semitism and Islamic radical anti-Semitism, you have these two, this couple, resentment or envy, and the apocalypse, sort of millenarianism. That's jihadism.
It's revolutionary anti-Semitism.
Revolutionary.
Yes, gentlemen.
How are the European educational systems dealing with World War II, Nazism, anti-Semitism, and these issues? How is this next generation, several generations being educated? How is it taught? Is there any, in terms of government and or other ways that people thought about how to deal with these issues?
There are some studies looking into the Holocaust, how it's taught. I know of a study in Germany, and I think one in the UK. And often there is a very, how to put it, it's very little in the Holocaust education about the Holocaust. If you talking about the programs, but there is an attempt by some to do so. But then it's often related in a biased way to Israel. Yeah, so you have that in many textbooks in Germany, that the history of Israel is related directly to the Holocaust in a way that gives Israel a very negative image. In textbooks. And there was a study just published 3 months ago on that. So it's not, there's a lot of room for improvement, if I can say. So in France, I see, my wife is a teacher in a French school. She just received a week ago a letter from the ministry that they want to have more projects, school projects on combating racism and anti-Semitism explicitly. What they're going to do is that, I don't know, but they see that's a problem. That has been identified as a problem since 2003. That was widely ignored. 2002, in fact, there was a book published on that, but has been widely ignored. That is a problem in the schools. But this is the case, as far as I can see, in all the countries that I know in Europe. The teaching about the Holocaust is often a very difficult issue, not only for teachers. There's resentments against it from teachers, but also from students, and it's still a hot topic where anti-Semitic resentments often come up. But I just want to say one thing about I didn't forget that, I wouldn't say necessarily if somebody calls for one-state solution that's anti-Semitic. But I say that is a very strong indication, and this, by the way, I deal with that in other ways, but often it's a very strong indication for anti-Semitic resentment. Why do I say it? It is a very dangerous idea if you think that's true. If you call for one-state solution, the abolishment of the Jewish state of Israel, if you think that's true, that is implicitly you I wouldn't say agree, but you don't have strong objections to potential genocide there.
I'm not going to debate it because I don't support a one-state solution. So I,
yeah.
but you know, I think we'll just leave it.
Yes, the back.
Are these anti-Semites completely nuts? Because the more anti-Semitism you have, the more Jews you have. The less anti-Semitism you have, the fewer the Jews you have. They assimilate very quickly within just a few generations. And now every Jewish leader in the world is grinning from ear to ear that they actually have a unifying point for the Jews who 20 years ago the rabbis were saying, in 100 years in America, there's not going to be any more Jews. Now they're all grinning from ear to ear because they can say everybody's out to get us, and if you leave the Jewish religion, nobody will accept you because they're all anti-Semites. So instead of having fewer Jews, you're going to have more Jews.
Does anybody want to respond to that?
I just don't understand the question. If it was a question, it was a comment, I don't really understand what you're...
Well, I mean, basically, that the database involving the Jews and the Jewish population is ignore the Jews or welcome the Jews into your society, and they're going to go away. If you're anti-Semitic toward the Jews, you're going to get more Jews.
Is there any kind of rationale behind anti-Semitism when it grows? I think, Jeff, that's what you're...
Yeah.
I think that is something, yeah.
You're going to get
May I
more
respond
Jews.
to that? May I respond to that? The
Yeah.
irrationality, this is something very hard to fathom. So this is something what even those who are genuinely wanting to combat anti-Semitism, it's often very hard to see there is no reason really
there is no good reason for hatred against Jews. So we have to take it as an ideology. We have to treat it as an ideology. And what you were referring to there, I mean, Jean-Paul Sartre, he said, well, those the Jews are those who the anti-Semites define who is a Jew and who is not a Jew. But this is maybe another debate, and I think that would leave. I don't know where that's going to lead, but obviously it has become a growing problem for Jewish communities all over the world. The attacks that we see, and not only in Europe, unfortunately, but also in other countries.
I heard your friend Dean Schwartz use the word optimism, and I'll tell you a reason for optimism. This university campus with the vignette that last Tuesday and yesterday, the Minnesota Student Association, 500 people in the microbiology lecture room, kaleidoscope at the entire university, discussing the most difficult issues and resolutions involving PDS and anti-Semitism. And this discussion was conducted with great civility and respect amongst the students. So that's a reason for optimism, to use the word today for Dean Schwartz.
So in her comments, Professor Lorcin sort of pointed to some of the commonalities between anti-Islamic discourse in Europe and anti-Semitic discourse. I'm wondering if you all see any potential for coalition building between European Muslims and Jews on the basis that they have both been excluded from belonging in Europe in very similar ways.
If I may say one thing, so there are some historians and intellectuals who embrace, actually Emmanuel Todd, the one I mentioned a little bit like this, embrace this idea of a sort of supersession theory that Islamophobia is actually today the new anti-Semitism, right? That is, the people who are, suffering from victimization, from discrimination, are no longer the Jews but the Muslims. That's one theory that came up with Enzo Traverso, the historian at Cornell, for example, and so on. I think it's very complicated because statistics show, and I'm not a sociologist, that massively anti-Semitism and attacks against Jews come from young Muslims very often. So that creates an extremely complicated situation to think about. I mean, that would be great in a utopian world, right, to construe an alliance obviously between Muslims and Jews, or people victims of racism, anti-Muslim, and discrimination, but I don't think it's very realistic to imagine that in the current conditions of hostility.
Can I offer
yes, go ahead.
A counter-example? So there is a book which actually may come close to positing this thesis that you're saying about, but she has a really good example of queer and Muslim groups in the Netherlands who have allied together because they see themselves as positioned as outside of the state in similar ways. And this is a group of two people that we would traditionally not see as being able to collaborate, but when people are able to see the way that they're positioned against white supremacy in a similar way, there sometimes becomes opportunities for collaboration.
I would, I'll just be quick. I would say that we see some examples of that in our community here in Minnesota. There have been, and it's been very encouraging and very gratifying to see engagement between the Jewish community and the Muslim community here, in particular the Somali American community here, victims of all kinds of vilification, Muslim American community here and the Somali American community in particular, and I think there've been, I think Steve's probably been involved in some of them, but there've been great examples of engagement between those communities. And I think, it informed, at least in some measure, in common experiences.
There have been many attempts in different European countries to form these alliances, mostly by Jewish community leaders, to go to Muslim communities because they're much larger, and to see if they can find allies. Only very few of them have been successful. And that is partly because the majority of Muslim organizations that are organized as Muslim organizations are influenced by Islamists. So they're very close to Muslim Brotherhood or others. If you are close to Muslim Brotherhood, if you have an Islamist ideology behind it, part of the Islamist ideology is anti-Semitism. Then you have the books by the Muslim Brotherhood, Al-Qutb and others, who Al-Qutb wrote a book, Our Struggle with the Jews. So this is truly part of the Islamist ideology. And this is also the reason why many in these circles where the local mosques are influenced by these Islamist organizations, you have the view that the Jews and the Muslims are enemies is very strong. So these approaches are then not successful because they see the Jews as the enemy. There is an anti-Semitic ideology within radical Islam, within Islamism, even if it's not violent Islamism. And that is also, I think, very important to differentiate between Islamists and non-Islamists. And we also, I think, have to look very carefully in the organizations really we deal with. So many of these Muslim organizations who claim to be representative are not representative, in fact, and we have that also in America here with CARE and others, are directly affiliated to Muslim Brotherhood organizations. So we have to be careful if we want to form alliances with whom we do it.
I think we've got time for one more question.
Yeah, my question, you've been talking about Eastern and Western Europe. I'm thinking about individual countries and looking at the Northern European countries like Denmark, Sweden, and I've traveled all around Europe and I've observed none of this type of behavior, or very little of it, especially up in Denmark and Sweden, where throughout history, you know, rescuing the Jews in Denmark in World War II, providing a safe haven in Sweden, there just doesn't seem to be that up there. Do you think there's some reason for that? Or?
Sweden has become a very anti-Semitic country recently.
They have been, recently, okay, but not Denmark.
Oh, the history is not so good as you might.
Not good.
Denmark's different. Denmark's a bit different, but in Sweden not.
Okay.
Okay. Well, I think we can stop there and carry on informally, and let's thank the panel for